I do want to say very much thank you to all who are attending here this afternoon. It's, I think, an excellent opportunity to learn more about this band. I very much welcome your questions. And so you'll notice, I hope you'll notice that on the web screen for this webinar, there's an ability for you to ask questions. And if you ask questions, what I'd like you to know is I'll see them pop up, and I'm going to try and answer them as we go through. Got a little screen here. If it seems more appropriate to wait until the end, I may hold off or to a slide that's relevant to that question. But I think this will be more interesting for all involved. Try to keep the information pretty basic, but I think there will be some questions as we go forward. So to advance then here to the first screen. Looks like I started on the end here, so we'll go back to the beginning. To advance then to the first screen, the outline of what we'll be talking about today is laid out on this slide. So we'll take a look then at the history of this band and licensing in the band, talk about key FCC rules for both use of the spectrum and for leasing, talk about what goes on in the leasing world, give some examples, and as I mentioned, take your questions both during the webinar and as we go through towards the end. So that's our outline today. Again, this is intended to be really for the benefit of parties holding EBS licenses, but I certainly would appreciate comments and suggestions from the entire group here. So in terms of the band, this was originally established really for educational television. And that use continues today in a few cities. That's, full broadcast TV capabilities. It operates on higher frequencies than conventional television, but just like is now happening in the UHF band, these television bands have been converted over into really wireless internet services. So there was an effort in the 70s and really running through to the late 90s to have a so-called wireless cable television service that ultimately they attempted to compete with satellite and cable TV, but were ultimately unsuccessful. And that's why beginning in the late 90s, the FCC gave permission to allow two-way service, data service on these types of licenses. And many companies would, in fact, lease that spectrum for two-way fixed data. But in 2005, the FCC approved new two-way rules for mobile as well as fixed service. And it's been that mobile service that has really driven the full value of the licenses today that we see in leasing activity. And it's also helped require changes in the rules that I'll talk about to some effect, to some impact on license holders. Overall, very positive. So the current commercial uses are really two, and as we see essentially Sprint has built a 4G mobile wireless network. 4G LTE is the current technology. They're just in the process of shutting down their WiMAX network and transitioning 100% to LTE. This is the really international standard for wireless networks today. So far, Sprint has announced construction of an LTE network on this frequency, covering about 40% of the population. They cover, I think, over 90% when you count their other frequencies. But these higher frequencies are being used to provide very high capacity data, and Sprint primarily uses those in major cities. In addition, we have multiple smaller companies, including, well, Dish Network, not such a small company, but a well-known example that have built fixed wireless networks. You can see here, this is a guy standing, next to the eave of a house where there's an antenna bolted on. And you'll see that unlike the mobile phones, that's a directional antenna. It faces a tower, some distance away, because it has a better antenna, because it's outdoors, because it's higher. The capacity on these fixed wireless networks will generally be much higher. And so as licensees consider potentially leasing their spectrum or how it will be used, it's going to have a different type of network, a different type of use, a different type of potentially revenue, depending on whether it goes into the mobile network or the fixed network. But the same frequencies, the same licenses can be used for either. So one of the changes that occurred at the time when the FCC ruled that they were going to allow two-way service is the original licenses had really had a disc shape or circular diameter. 35-mile radius was the licensed area. And so you had full coverage of that area. And because antennas were directional, even if there was an overlap, both parties could operate successfully. There wasn't any problem. When we went to the mobile devices, obviously they do not have the directional antennas. And so there was a need to take that area towards the edge of a circle that might overlap with another license and essentially divide it between the two opportunities. We call this splitting the football. If you look on the right of this screen, you can see where those two licenses that started out as circles, overlapped. There would have been an area, the two overlapping areas would have had more or less the shape of a football, and that just gets divided in half. So if you hear about people splitting the football, that was the arrangement that the industry and the FCC came up with. It did reduce the size of the licenses, but it also made them much more usable in a mobile environment, and it has encouraged the development of standards that have been very important in the band. So we've talked about the geographical aspect of these licenses. I'd like to also discuss the spectrum location of the licenses. On this slide, you'll see both the salmon colored licenses, those are the educational licenses, educational broadband service that are held by institutions like yours, as well as the blue and green licenses shown here. Those are the broadband radio service licenses, all part of the 2.5 gigahertz band. But the EBS licenses must have educational use, must follow slightly different rules in terms of how they're used, in part to support educational services, whereas the commercial services do not have those requirements. The EBS licenses can only be held by educational institutions, accredited academic institutions, and educational nonprofits, while the BRS licenses can be held by a much wider assortment of corporations and individuals. The typical license, for example, if we look at the A group here, you'll see on the left-hand side, A1, A2, A3. Each of those channels is 5.5 megahertz wide, so a total of 16.5 megahertz of contiguous spectrum. See on the left-hand side here. And then the A4 would also typically be part of that same license. So a total of 22.5 megahertz when you add the 6 megahertz associated with the A4. That's a typical license. Some are less, a very few are more, but that's what many institutions hold. And it would cover an area similar to what I showed on the previous slide. So that's a typical organization. As you can see, there's actually more educational spectrum in this band, typically 5 licenses, A, B, C, D, and G on the right-hand side, as opposed to the commercial where we have the E, F, and H groups, similar in size to the typical educational license. And then separately, there's the BRS1 and the BRS2, which are 6 megahertz each. So this was a result of the new band plan that was developed in 2005. Essentially, almost all of the country has now converted to this band plan. So that's what most licensees hold. So we talked about what the licenses are and how they're used. I mentioned that a little bit of this use is still for educational television, but the vast majority is really for delivering either mobile or fixed internet. And so the way that has happened is that between the commercial channels and the leased capacity on educational channels, multiple commercial companies have built wireless networks. And this has really been a significant success. I mentioned the Sprint numbers. Altogether, 45 companies, wireless companies, have EBS licenses. We're seeing a huge increase in the demand for these licenses, substantially because this is not just a domestic band, it's an international band. There's over 100 million Chinese now who have devices that operate in these frequencies. And so that has tended to push down the cost of the devices and the infrastructure that are required to use this band. So companies like Jab Broadband and Whisper ISP here listed previously began operations using unlicensed frequencies. They're delivering wireless broadband typically in more rural locations and competing with cable broadband or DSL from the telephone companies. And many customers, there's several million customers using these types of fixed wireless broadband networks. But as the number of customers goes up, as the demand for total capacity continues to increase very dramatically for internet access, they're finding that their unlicensed frequencies are getting congested. The ranges that they can operate are shortening. Their cost of maintenance due to interference issues is going up. And so many of the more successful wireless ISPs are taking the combination of increasing problems on their unlicensed frequencies and the reduced cost of equipment and capabilities, improved capacity and improved capabilities on these fixed wireless licensed networks, and that's driving significantly increased demand. So far, there's over 1,800 EBS leases, so the majority of the EBS licenses are in fact have been leased out, but there are many that are also capable of being leased, and that's really the focus of this conversation today, is about those licenses that still have the opportunity to do a new lease or to do a replacement lease as the existing lease expires. So talk some about existing FCC rules for leasing, and those are significant and relevant to what each of the license holders here should consider. The first of all is at least 20 hours per channel. So if you notice, we had typically 4 channels in an EBS license. So 4 times 20 would be 80 hours per week of educational use. Well, if you think about how often and how much people use their either internet access at their home or business or to a mobile device, it really turns out that that's not a very high standard for a typical license. That 80 hours can be accomplished by 10 devices averaging 8 hours a week. It's not a whole lot of use, to be honest. The other standard of the FCC is that 5% of the capacity has to be reserved for educational use. It has to be there and available for educational use if there's demand and the finances to support it. So that's important in terms of showing the FCC that although the license, the so-called excess capacity, which people refer to as the 95% capacity, may be leased out, there is a portion of the capacity that's being used for educational purposes. The maximum term of any lease. So this is important in terms of the relevance of the auction and decisions that parties are making. If you've received an email from us over the last month or so indicating that you've been invited to participate in the Spectrum lease auction, that means that your license doesn't show on a lease on the FCC database. So there's 2 possibilities. One might be that there just is no lease. Another is that it was leased prior to January 10th of 2005. The FCC treated those leases differently. They don't show up on the Universal Licensing Service database. And so, it looks as if it's unleased. And in fact, since it has only a 15-year term, if it was signed in 2000, it would be expiring this year at the latest. It could be shorter than that, but that would be the latest. If it was signed in 2004, it would be expiring in 2019, and you can kind of do the arithmetic for those in between. So that's a significant number of licenses that are coming up for auction, or that are where there's the possibility of getting a new lessee to occupy the bandwidth. No requirement, but it's a possibility. So to talk about what we have done in the past, we are believers that the auction approach is the best way to get the maximum value for licenses and to allow transactions to flow through smoothly. It creates a market in a situation where there really has been sort of one-on-one negotiations, but not necessarily a real market or a competitive market. So we took number of well over a year to assemble 109 licenses in the last Spectrum lease auction. We managed 75 of those directly, and of those 75, we managed 85% of those licenses were leased. By the way, this auction was concentrated in the Southeast. That's where the majority of the licenses were, but there were some in other parts of the country as well. There were 34 managed by other parties. They didn't have quite the same success rate, but overall, the auction raised the commitments are over $140 million in lease payments over the next 30 years. More than 10 million has been paid out already. And I would say in general, our clients were very happy with the results of this. We got what we think were good values, and really decided that this is something that we want to do this year and continuing at least for the next several years as leases made before 2005 are running to their maximum term. So for 2015, our goal is to exceed the 2014 auction results. We had 55 bidders signed up as of last night. Turns out we've had at least 2 or 3 new bidders come through today. So I certainly expect that total number to be in excess of 60 very soon. That's a significant, like 5 times increase over the number of bidders, active bidders, that we had in the last Spectrum auction. And it primarily relates to this interest that we've had in some of the smaller operators who operate in rural territories. As I mentioned, 109 licenses last time. We are contacting holders of over 500 EBS licenses. So we certainly don't have that many signed up so far, but we're working hard to increase the number that we have. And then just to provide a little bit more background, in addition to those EBS licenses where there's either no existing lease or the existing lease will expire relatively soon, we're also offering leases that might be held by a commercial operator that's willing to sell those leases. And that's happened in the past. We have a number of those signed up for this year as well. And then BRS licenses. Those can be leased to a commercial entity, or they can actually be sold. So we're having both possibilities in that case. Again, we think the auction will significantly improve the value and liquidity of these licenses. And we think it's the best way to really form a market and to allow license holders to get the best overall value and to have a fair process. So showing here the licenses that we've targeted for inclusion, you see that a number of interesting points. First of all, the licenses generally tend to be where most of the people are. You'll see an overlap there of kind of consistent with the population as a whole. You also notice there's lots of areas in the western part of the country where it seems that the licenses have a full circular shape. They're not overlapping. And in fact, there's vacant space between licenses. That's good news for us. Number one, the license holders have the full geographic coverage possible of their license. But beyond that, we expect the FCC to eventually rule, hopefully soon, on a process that would allow these unlicensed areas to be licensed. And that's a way that we think that more commercial operators will become interested in the auction. I guess a good point is when we offer all these licenses simultaneously, it makes it easier for a commercial operator to decide to step into this band. To date, this band has been most of the licenses were by Nextel and Sprint and Clearwire. Those all came together now under Sprint. So that's the major party that has been doing the leasing. And then there have been many smaller entities that have leased as well. By aggregating this large number of licenses and by showing the potential for future licenses in areas that are currently unlicensed, we think it makes it much more interesting to large commercial operators to step in, potentially pick up multiple licenses at the same time and compete directly for the spectrum. So improving, we think, market value. And this is a situation where you might think that, conventionally more supply and would tend to drive down the price. We believe that more supply in this particular market actually can have an increasing factor on price because it creates more competition. Typically, a license holder would want to have multiple licenses in a particular area. So this next map shows you that we have a long way to go in terms of actually getting a number of committed licenses in the auction. We've frankly been doing better on the bidder side than we have been doing on the lessor side, the license holder side. There is quite good spectrum depth in some of these areas in the southeast, in northern Florida, and in Georgia and Alabama. That's a powerful area for us. We do have conversations. There's another market coming up in Kansas. It's actually been signed up. We haven't gotten it on the drawing yet, where there'll be 4 licenses altogether, one on top of the other. So very good depth of spectrum. We think those are kind of areas that are going to be attractive to license holders. And we just encourage all of you who are thinking about this to consider joining the auction. So let me talk about values. The first message here is there is no such thing as a typical EBS deal. Each deal really ends up being rather individual. It's a function of the competition that can be created in a particular market, the amount of demand that is there based on different operators' plans, and the amount of supply. And as I said, it may be better to have more supply of spectrum rather than less. We took a typical example. This was a license out of Stillwater, Oklahoma that was convenient. We found that the total coverage of that license was 120,000 pops. So pops are people. So that is a license that covers homes of something over 40,000 homes, and with the population density in that area, turns out to be 120,000 people live under the geographic area. It looks similar to the ones that I showed you before. It's a full license, so a full license has 22.5 megahertz. That comes out to be 2.7 million megahertz pops. And we put what I consider to be a typical, or average is probably a better term, valuation on that spectrum. We said 4 cents per megahertz pop. And you'll hear people in the industry talk about a 3-cent deal or a 5-cent deal, whatever it might be. Important to remember that the offers in the auction can be higher or lower than that. This is the same number that I've shown to the bidders, so they're aware of this. In a rural environment, this is in the range of what they might expect to pay. So if you take that 2.7 million megahertz pops times 4 cents, that equates to a total value of $108,000. But importantly, this is a lease, not a sale. And so we have to somehow convert that $108,000 into an upfront payment and monthly payments. They could also be quarterly or annual, but they have to be essentially periodic payments. We see at least most of the leases take this form. There's other possibilities. We're certainly going to allow the bidders to give whatever form of proposal they want. We do want to see them include at least 10% of the total net present value of the offering of the bid as an upfront payment, because we think that shows a certainty that they are actually committed to going forward, and it will also cover the transaction costs. In this particular case, to get to $108,000 net present value, if you put 10% upfront, the initial annual rent comes out to $626, or with a 3% annual increase. To let you know, someone could bid higher monthly rent and no annual increase. That would be a possibility. We're giving them flexibility in terms of how they would structure the offers. But we do have a spreadsheet that we will apply and provide an evaluation. It's based on a 10% overall discount rate. So future payments are valued at less than current payments. And that's why the total payments, even though we're saying it's $108,000 total net present value, the total payments are over almost $368,000 over a full 30 years. We would also typically see something like 10 free connections for educational use. That's that's a sort of a normal standard or kind of a low-level standard in terms of the number of free connections, and that allows the educator to meet the FCC requirements, and obviously also provides the advantages of the educator could give either to staff members or to deserving students for whatever the particular use might be. Sometimes we've seen these used for connecting remote buildings that are not easily connected to a main school. So there's different versions of how this can be used as long as it supports the educational mission of the institution. So, so that was what I would consider to be on the low end of valuation. This is an actual example, was disclosed by our client. We normally don't disclose these valuations, by the way, but this was publicly released as part of the board approval process and the sunshine value or sunshine law in the state of Florida. So they showed that for the lease of 2 licenses, one covered really just the Fort Lauderdale, Broward County area. The other also covered the majority of Miami plus Broward County. They received an upfront payment of $7.9 million, and the total commitments, if the lessee keeps the lease in service over 30 years, $80.7 million. So you can see there's a wide range, and obviously those licenses in the bigger cities tend to go not just for higher value because there's more people, but also the unit rate tends to be higher. This one was calculated to be 24.5 cents per megahertz pop total value. So we think that this this auction approach, lease auction approach that we took in 2014 was really quite instrumental in trying to obtain a lot more competition. We think it was successful. We intend to continue it. We think it's consistent with how the FCC is doing it, and even though we didn't raise $45 billion, billion with a B, that the FCC did in their last AWS 3 auction, we felt comfortable that this had achieved a good result for most of the participants. So in terms of what's going on with the current auction, I wanted to provide some specifics here. We are trying to get all the parties signed up by October 15. I guess I should mention, while we had a long time to organize the last auction, we feel it's important to run these annually. We also know that the FCC is planning a major auction of its spectrum in the so-called 600 megahertz band. Sometimes you'll call it the TV incentive auction is one of the terms. And that's being held next year, next March, I think is when it begins. But the applicants all have to submit their first round applications by the end of this year, potentially in late November. So we think it's important to get our bids in by the 29th of October. The 15th also happens to be the last day of a conference of potential bidders. We're going to be there signing up more bidders. And so we want to have a good incentive. And we're going to need some time between when we collect the last parties that are signed up and when we actually accept the first bids. All of the parties that sign up for the auction get access to a secure website that provides detail on all of the licenses that are being offered. We'll provide each offering party that signs up for the auction with a map of their spectrum, a population count. We'll give them a broker's value. This is not a full appraisal, but it's, I find in many cases, at least as accurate as a full appraisal in this band. And then once the bids come in, we will provide this financial analysis for each bid. We'll offer negotiating help. And our approach is really a success fee. There's no commitment. If you get offered millions and millions of dollars for your license and you choose not to lease it, that's perfectly acceptable. That's your choice. That's the choice of the educator and the license holder. And like a real estate deal, if the lease is not completed, we don't get paid. Our fee starts at $5,000 as a minimum. 5% is the rate for smaller deals. I think in the situation I just showed, the total commission was a little over $5,000 for the $108,000 at present value deal in Oklahoma example. The rate actually goes down as a percentage as the value of the leases goes up. So we do the evaluation for you. We give you the numbers. We'll tell you what our commission will be if you choose to accept it. To date, we have 44 licenses committed to the auction. We're working to try to increase that. That's in part the purpose of this webinar, but it's also to answer your questions. And so there's more information on our website, but at this point, I want to open the floor to more questions and encourage anyone to type those in. Also, I'll go ahead and put my smiling face back up here on the screen. So we don't have any, I don't see any questions out there so far. See if we'll give people a little bit of time to jump in with them. All right, so we have a first question. How can these files be downloaded? So that's in terms of what's on the website now on the webinar site. And by the way, I have Megan, who's an employee, and also my daughter and tech support here working with me. I think they're available through the webinar site, but we will also put them up on our screen or on our website so that you can download. I think the frequently asked questions are already there. The summary is already there. We have not put the auction letter agreement out there. Was kind of holding that off for a more specific crowd here, but I'll be very glad to send that to anyone. If you want to send an email either to myself at the email you see on the screen or to James Bridges, either of us would be very glad to send you the ALA. You do try to click though on the handouts slide to see if that helps. And then I have more questions appearing here and I'm having trouble reading them. Megan, can you help me with this? For some reason, it's difficult to see the questions here. I got lots of them. That's good. Maybe expand this. Seems there ought to be an easier way to read this. There we go. All right, from a technology implementation perspective, can you provide some key points as to why EBS leaseholders are better off leasing spectrum and working with the bidders versus trying to meet their customer use case by buying the infrastructure to implement their use case? So if you have the budget and if it's consistent with your institution's goals to build a network, then that certainly was part of what the FCC had in mind originally. And I think it's actually a positive for license holders who have that kind of capability. We've seen it at Northern Michigan University in, I think it's Kings County, California, or Kern County, I'm not sure, where significant networks have been built out. What we find is that for I have to say 95% of the license holders, EBS license holders, they look at the cost of building an LTE network, which is really designed more for these carrier applications, and they look at their priorities and they say they're better off allowing the carrier to spend the hundreds of thousands or millions, depending on the network, to build a network and getting some free service plus the cash. So it really has to do with what your institution's priorities are. And for those who do want to build their own, we'd be glad to put them in touch with equipment makers who can give them quotes on doing that. I think I answered the question about the downloaded I see that came from George Bott, and George will be glad to get them to you if you have any trouble with downloading. We have a quote here: "We are extremely rural. Do you have potential bidders for the most rural?" We do have potential bidders. Among the 55 are some in very rural areas. As I said, we expect to have more. We're headed out to this conference next month of the wireless ISPs. And you know, at the pace we've been going, we're going to have bidders, I think, in most all areas of the country. Some of them, you know, these are small businesses. They won't necessarily be able to pay high prices, but the auction is intended to provide for those bidders to submit bids, and then you can decide whether you like them or not. Next question. In Texas, is board approval required to enter into the auction, or can that be done at the time of the final decision? I don't know. I think that sort of varies by the policy of the individual school. We say basically you're not making a commitment. It's a marketing proposal, and you take the bid to the board after you receive it, and they would have to, you know, at that point approve the transaction in its entirety. If you do get a transaction done, you'll owe us a commission, so you have to decide whether, okay, is that a commitment that has to be board level approved or not. And I do apologize that in some cases this auction we didn't get enough advance notice to people. But as I say, if you can't make the time schedule, we will provide greater notice next time. We expect to be doing these at least once a year, and that would be another chance. Next question, what is the success rate of completing the leases for full term? Is that info available? So there's kind of two questions there. What is the success rate of getting the leases done once we get a bid come in? We had last time I said we got 85% of our deals done. I would say we had another 5% where there was an offer, but for whatever reason the parties couldn't reach a final negotiated transaction. It does take time. You know, we're talking about something like up to a year in the long cases. But the second question is, okay, once the lease is in effect, what's the success rate? I would say with Sprint, it's been 100%. They've, you know, kept everything, maybe not through full term yet, but they've kept all their leases in good shape, at least that I know of. With smaller companies, there have been some bankruptcies, and so in those cases, some of those leases have not finished. I think that that phenomenon is substantially behind us, because I think it relates to a time when there was more expensive equipment, and when the business models didn't make as much sense, and there was less demand really for broadband. So I think that time is coming to the end, my perspective. Can you clarify if there's an upfront cost for participating in the auction? There's no upfront cost to participate. The only, you know, you'll need to spend some time with us, fill out a form that says if you're successful, you owe us a commission. In return for that, you get our marketing efforts, you get an evaluation of your license in terms of what it's worth. We write it up to explain what's unique about your area. So we do all that as our marketing expense, and we only get a percentage if the lease is successful. And by the way, that comes really out of the upfront payment. It's just a deduction of the money that comes from the lessee, from the bidder. So it's essentially no cost to you unless you have success, and then really that money comes from another party. I saw in your presentation that there's no cost if you decline the offer. To confirm, that means no out-of-pocket cost. Correct, no out-of-pocket cost, zero. We are concerned about low bids. Yes, you almost certainly with the small companies that we're talking about, you're going to get some low bids. The question is whether you get some high bids as well that will satisfy you. And we're going to do everything we can to increase competition. We're talking to all of the largest companies that have big budgets that could potentially give you very satisfactory bids. we can't promise. The only thing we can promise is that we'll work hard and get the best bids. Well, we think the best bids that are possible in this environment. We do know the parties. We've got agents out there beating the bushes. We've got employees contacting all the prospective bidders. So, I think we've got a good chance to get you the best bids possible, and then you just have to decide whether they're good enough or not. And hopefully, I think based on our success rate last time, most of the bidders will end up with bids that they're satisfied with, or most of the offerers, I apologize, will end up with bids that they're satisfied with, and will end up with leases they're satisfied with. So that's my prediction. It's based on past success, but we can't guarantee necessarily that it will be true this time. Is the bid a one-time offer, or could lower bids raise, and so forth? So the way this is designed to work is that we will collect and analyze the first round of bids that come in on the 29th of October, and we will deliver to you, to each license holder, all of the bids that come in for their license. And we're even encouraging individual bidders to potentially submit more than one bid for the same asset. So they could, for example, submit a bid that is heavily weighted towards upfront, or they could submit a second bid that had more of an increase over time, and they could even submit a third bid that said, okay, well, we're not going to pay you so much in terms of cash, but we'll give you lots of service credits. We'll let's say substantially build this network for you. We're going to do the financial analysis of all of those. We're going to provide you with the rest of the information. We'll be available to consult with you. What we often recommend when there's multiple bids is that we go back to the bidders who have given, reasonably attractive bids, who are competitive, and let them know that they're competitive. They're maybe shortlisted is sometimes a term that we use. We'll ask them if they would like to submit another bid. We'll give them a date by when that is due. So you really end up having a second round and taking the process, which we're calling an auction, but honestly is a modified version, a lease auction. Leases are more complicated than simple purchases. And particularly in this case where services are delivered as well, there's more complication. We'll give them a chance to submit second rounds. We'll maybe take back comments for you. And once that first round of bids comes in, really, I would say that the control of the process is in the hands of the spectrum rights holder, of the licensee. So you're in control. We're going to provide advice. We'll do the work if you want us to do the work, or we'll let you, work directly with the bidders if you prefer. But it ends up being more of a custom process that is along the lines of what you would do if you were selling any major asset and you wanted to obtain the best deal possible.